Thank you very much, and good morning from my side as well. And as Anne kindly introduced me, then yes, I am a sort of space law person since a long time ago, and got into cyberspace also. So this is a really fantastic topic for me, my favorite topic, one of the few things worth getting up for on a rainy Friday morning when you've all been to a party last night. But I'm sure it will be well worth it. How we will do it, I think, is we will have about 20 minutes for the speakers, and then one or two relatively short questions immediately after the talk if you want to address something exactly that speaker said, in order to keep some time for a discussion at the end. So bigger questions, and so I think will be more interesting actually when we've heard three a bit different perspectives on this extremely topical and interesting issue. As you will hear, it is something that, cyberspace and space are talked about a lot because the two influence one another when it comes to rulemaking and so perhaps especially for lawyers, but also for others generally, how do we deal with these issues? But also more and more we see how we need to think about cyberspace in space and maybe space in cyberspace. So those are the topics we will have from different angles, the business world, the military world. But we will start with James. So James Paver is an Oxford PhD student and looking at satellites, space-based systems, security of them. And I think if I have got it right, the name of your talk will be the impact of cyber weapons in outer space. So please, I give the floor first to you.
Walk back here real quick. Thanks. Hi. So yeah, I'm honored to start off this presentation with a paper entitled The Cyber ASAT, ASAT meaning anti-satellite weapon, that kind of theorizes about the strategic effect of cyber weapons in the domain of outer space. Space is important to kind of NATO audience. This might seem obvious, but since the earliest days of the space race, there's kind of been a recognition that space has this unique allure to military strategic purposes. Lyndon Johnson, when he was a senator in the earliest days of the space race, said control of space means control of the world. And this kind of embodies the tantalizing myth of space as an ultimate high ground, that whoever controls the heavens controls the earth, the sea, and the sky. And whether or not this is completely true, it has become clear that space is a vital component of how modern militaries approach warfighting and strategy. This was particularly demonstrated by the overwhelming victory of US and Allied forces during the Gulf War, when space-based systems are widely attributed for providing unprecedented C4ISR capabilities, so the ability to communicate to individual warfighters, to have unparalleled intelligence from imaging satellites, and to have precise positional information. Given how important space systems have become, it's kind of strange that this number here is 0 by my count. People aren't attacking satellites in the status quo. We're not seeing satellites blow up in every battlefield operation. And this doesn't make intuitive sense. Satellites are extremely visible. You just need a telescope to know where they are. They're fragile because launch costs are difficult and expensive. They move very fast, which means a small piece of debris can do serious damage, and they're not operationally responsive. Once a satellite is destroyed, it may take months or years to replace it. So in this presentation, I'll kind of start out by asking the theoretical question about why this isn't happening, why there aren't space wars in the status quo. And I'll draw out three kind of arguments from the literature that argue why we aren't using kinetic ASATs. And then I'll build on that with the cyber context, thinking about how a cyber anti-satellite weapon might interface with these same domain features. And I'll contend that there are differences in cyber weapons that are particularly concerning from a space perspective and might have concerning impacts on space strategy. However, this presentation is explicitly interdisciplinary. I come from a mixed background with some IR stuff, as well as I'm doing more technical computer science work now. And so I wanted to put this to the test as well and build a simulated cyber ASAT capability. So we also kind of look at what this would be in practice. We walk through simulations where we design a cyber ASAT weapon to get a feel for what one might look like and a feel for how difficult it would be to develop these capabilities. So the first theoretical constraint against space wars is a very intuitive one, and that relates to accessibility. This is a picture actually from something that happened after I published the paper. This is the recent Indian anti-satellite weapon test, and it's kind of your traditional kinetic ASAT. You have a rocket that's full of fire, The fire pushes something hard into orbit, which crashes into a satellite, breaks it into a million pieces, mission accomplished. As simple as that sounds from that kind of glib explanation, this is literally rocket science. And as a result, there aren't many countries that have this capacity. Depending on how you count, specifically within the EU, there are about 10 or so countries that have domestic orbital launch capabilities, the ability to put anything in orbit themselves, whether that is a space system for research or for imaging. And then within those, the subset of countries that have offensive capabilities is less than half. We're talking about 4 countries that have demonstrated the precision and finesse to use an offensive anti-satellite weapon kinetically. That's China, the US, Russia, and most recently India. Even when you get this far, even when you have a national space program, even when you know how to use it to attack a satellite, you still might not like doing so for the simple reason that it's very expensive to have a meaningful intercept capability. The cost of taking out, say, 3 or 4 key satellites is multiple rocket launches, potentially spaced over multiple days, and we're talking about an operation that scales towards the billions of dollars end of the spectrum, which means, except in scenarios of extreme need, kinetic ASAT is not necessarily very appealing. If we contrast this with the kind of cyber context, you see that the baseline threshold is met by all countries already. Everyone has access to computing technology, everyone has access to the internet, even non-state actors can kind of play in cyberspace. Moreover, a recent kind of offhand media remark by an NSA official estimated that there are about 100 countries with offensive cyber capabilities that are of concern to the United States. Now, there's a whole range of capacities within that list of countries, but I think it's fair to say that in general, a country is much closer to an offensive cyber program than they are to a national space program. And once you have that cyber program, once you have the expertise to build cyber weapons generally, the cost of a specific operation might be on the scale of hundreds, tens of thousands of dollars, maybe acquire some 0 days or hire some domain experts, but it's definitely not the same thing as launching a rocket. The next kind of general constraint that is talked about in the literature against kinetic ASATs is a normative one. This map behind me is a map of signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. Countries in green have signed and ratified it into international law. Countries in yellow have signed it. And the Outer Space Treaty, if there's one bit of consensus in the space policy literature, is not perfect. There are a lot of problems with the treaty, but it attempts to ban weaponization and militarization of outer space. And it's been around for a long time and has been widely adopted. 100+ parties have signed it, including all major spacefaring nations. And so as a result, it has an influence on the way states approach the use of kinetic anti-satellite weapons. Specifically, when states break the rules, when they push the boundaries, they do it couched in legal rhetoric, citing the Outer Space Treaty and talking about why it's justified, say, to remove hazardous materials from orbit that could threaten civilians, or because whatever they did is technically not a weapon, which kind of demonstrates that states feel a need to explain their misbehavior with kinetic ASATs in a way that they might not with cyber ASATs. Moreover, states feel this need in part because they know they'll get caught. Attributing a rocket launch is not very difficult. There are only so many places you can launch a rocket from. There's a lot of fire. There's a physical effect. You can have photographs like the one I just showed you. So states feel a need to justify what they're doing and to be sure they're willing to pay those diplomatic costs. In the cyber context, things are, again, pretty different. We have the Tallinn Manual, and we have some kind of international agreements on best actions and best practices in cyberspace, but we don't have anything like the Outer Space Treaty that's been codified into hundreds of countries' domestic law. And there's a long way to go in norms generation and perhaps lessons to be learned from the Outer Space Treaty, but those lessons haven't been put into effect yet. Moreover, states have demonstrated that they are fine pushing the boundaries in cyberspace. Whether this is US surveillance on allies, or Chinese state-sponsored hacking of companies, or Russian interference in the US elections, it's very clear that the rules, to the extent they exist in cyberspace, are still very malleable, and states are willing to take risks and kind of push the limits of what's acceptable. And part of this is because they think they might get away with it. Attribution is not as easy in cyberspace, even if it is possible, as it would be in an outer space context. There's a lot of plausible deniability, there's a lot of room for refutation that you simply don't have when someone has a video of a rocket leaving your country's spaceport. Finally, the last constraint I'm going to talk about relates to the space environment itself. So this animation behind me is debris that was generated by the 2007 Chinese ASAT test and 2 other debris generating incidents. Each of these dots is an existential threat to a satellite. These are pieces of metal or different orbital components that are flying at thousands of miles an hour, and if they collide with a satellite, they could cause it to disintegrate or to deorbit and stop functioning. As a result, when you launch a kinetic anti-satellite weapon and you break a satellite up, you add more pieces to the sphere, and that poses a high risk of collateral damage to your own space assets from this generated debris field, which is also highly difficult to predict, especially over the long term. And the long term matters because this debris will remain in orbit for potentially decades before it enters into the atmosphere and burns up. So even if there's a short-term benefit to a kinetic ASAT attack, that also has to outweigh the long-term costs to doing so. And everyone who could cause harm with the kinetic ASAT cares about this kind of thing. These are all spacefaring nations who have an interest in being able to use orbit themselves so they can get the benefit of that massive investment in a national space program. And so they're shared stakeholders in this ecology. If we look at the cyber context, things are again pretty different. You can imagine a zero debris counter space capability with cyber attack. For example, disabling one key sensor on a satellite system or eavesdropping on communications without necessarily directly damaging the satellite. Moreover, a cyber attack can be constrained and time-bound in a way that debris cannot. You could turn off a satellite for 3 key hours during a battlefield operation without permanently damaging it and having an impact on the environment. And finally, many of the attackers simply don't care about the space environment. If you're a small country that doesn't have a space program, you might view denying access to space to the United States for the next 20, 30 years as an upside to a cyber attack, because now they no longer can exercise those asymmetric advantages that space offers the powerful. So we've kind of made a theoretical case here that accessibility, deterrability, and the space environment have constrained the use of kinetic ASAT weapons, but that these same domain features are not as powerful with respect to cyber attacks on satellites. This is all to say that security in space won't come naturally anymore, if it's ever come naturally. Being able to defend satellites against cyber attacks will require conscious effort from industry, academia, and the public sector to consider these threats as a real and emerging change in the way domain operates. Rather than leave it there, this talk has been given many times. Essentially every new invention in space technology, whether it's an improved launch capacity or better precision, has been prophesied as bringing about the next era of space wars. And rather than immediately add my name to that ash heap of incorrect predictions, I'd like to kind of test this a little bit and get a better feel for what a cyber ASAT might look like. So we've designed a case study where we try to simulate a cyber ASAT. We make some pretty generous assumptions to keep the case study simple, but the hope is to kind of get a feel for what this might look like so we can get an idea of what defending against a cyber ASAT might look like. So our target in this simulation is a component of spaceflight operations called space situational awareness data. It was used to generate that image I showed you earlier of all the debris objects. Essentially, countries like the United States, Russia, and China operate distributed sensor networks around the world where they use radar and lasers to track debris objects in orbit and try to guess where those debris objects are going to go over the next couple of days. These estimates are then fed into a centralized repository of kind of orbital projections and characteristics, which are shared with third parties. These might be third-party spaceflight service operators like AGI, or these might be directly with satellite operators themselves through alerts or via open source APIs like spacetrack.org. And these projections are fed into a spaceflight operator's flight control systems. And they look for which debris objects might be coming near their satellites over the next couple of days, and they plan maneuvers if there's a debris object that poses a threat to avoid those objects. This isn't ideal. Every time you have to move a satellite, you use fuel, you increase risk of a mission failure, and you increase the cost of the mission. But it's definitely preferable to having your satellite get hit by a debris object and disintegrate. Our target for this attack isn't some esoteric space system. It's the stuff in red here. This is the bread and butter of cybersecurity attacks. It's databases, information at rest. It's network connections, information in transit. Our threat model is pretty straightforward and pretty generous to the attacker. First, we say that the attacker has gained some ability to influence stuff within those red dots. They either have found a 0 day in a database, like an Oracle database or something like that, or they're a man in the middle, or maybe they are the organizer. Maybe they are the people who are actually operating the database. So you could imagine, say, that you were Iran and you depended on the United States for space situational awareness data. You might not always trust that data if the US starts lying to you. Additionally, we make a very generous assumption, which is that space situational awareness data is not subject to additional verification. So in the real world, if there's a debris collision projected, you can call up the JSPOC and be like, you said this debris object is going to come close to my satellite. Can you verify that with additional sensing, or can you check this reading before we undergo a maneuver? We assume that this either doesn't happen, or that the attacker has found a way to manipulate the results of that second verification stage as well. And then finally, we do make the attacker do some work. They can't just invent debris objects that don't exist. They can't cause things to teleport. They need to try to be stealthy with the actual changes they make to this data set, with the goal of not getting immediately caught. In the theme of silent battle, we're going to try to have a silent attack. So our goal is to take something that's not going to collide with a satellite in the future, so a near miss event, and make it look like it'll be a collision. This has the benefit of potentially causing a satellite operator to move their satellite when they don't need to, which increases the cost of their space missions, shortens the lifespan of the satellites, and is kind of a slow burn effect, right? This isn't a catastrophic impact that generates debris, but it's the sort of thing a country might want to do if they're hostile but not in conflict to one of their adversaries. You can imagine a much worse version of this scenario using the same kind of mechanism, which would be where an attacker takes a projected collision event and conceals it. This could cause a short-term catastrophic failure, but it has the risk of generating a debris field, which may be acceptable to some adversaries, is unacceptable to others. The data we target in our simulation is stored in the format of a two-line element set. This is a widely used format for describing space objects' orbital characteristics. It was developed to actually use with punch cards on mainframe computers, which is why the format has so little information, but it's surprisingly accurate. Depending on how you propagate it, you can get about a kilometer of precision over a 72-hour period using widely available propagators. Our attacker will only be allowed to change these fields in the two-line element set. The idea being that if we limit what the attacker can change, we limit their effects, the risk of detection. And further in our paper, we actually outline also magnitude constraints on how much the attacker is allowed to change these fields. The first job the attacker has is figuring out which of the elements in this database of thousands and thousands of orbital objects are the best to change. So we call this our acquisition phase. This animation behind me kind of shows how we do this. So we have this sphere around our satellite, which is 1,000 kilometers in diameter, and we propagate the satellite that's going to be our victim for a 72-hour period. As one of those white dots enters the sphere at the height of the satellite, we then try to find its time of closest approach and the distance where it is at closest approach. The 5 objects that pass closest to the satellite are our candidates for manipulation that the attacker will try to target. In the next stage, which we call the perturbation stage, the attacker uses a genetic algorithm. So he treats the two-line element sets as a genome sequence, in essence, and tries to modify the characteristics of that two-line element set with 2 metrics of fitness. The first is the closest pass. So they want to minimize the distance that object comes from the satellite over the next 72 hours. The second thing that they try to modify over this genetic process is to minimize the amount of change they make. So these are our 2 metrics of fitness, and together we eventually find a scenario where the debris object falls within that zone of uncertainty surrounding the estimate. For our simulations, that was a 1 kilometer pass, but we actually found that it could probably be reduced down to 200 meters with a little bit more computing power and a larger debris field. Once you have a near miss scenario, or once you have now a collision scenario, you propagate that back into the database. So you put it back in the two-line element format in our generation phase, and you change the entry in the database very slightly to change the projection pretty dramatically from a non-collision event to a collision event. You'll notice here that these fields have been slightly modified. The underlined in red are all of the changes, and these are within constraints that are configurable. The attacker could then put this into the database and potentially impact spaceflight operations.